Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the BAARN online class, Business Continuity. Keep your work going even when disruption strikes. We are recording this session so that it can be available on demand and along with our other classes, which we'll be telling you about as well. I am Molly Quinlan Hayes. I'm Executive Director of the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, known to its friends as NCAPER. And I'm joined by my colleague, Tom Clareson.
Hi, everyone. Tom Clareson. I am the project director for BAARN, and I also work as a senior consultant for digital and preservation services at the Lyrasis Library, Archive, and Museum Network.
And just to give you a little bit of context, BAARN is a project of NCAPER, which is 20 years old this year. And it is a coalition of interested organizations that came together because of the huge gaps in the infrastructure that existed after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And in that time, we've been working in the areas of field education, advocacy and policy, information and connection, and leadership to help move this forward in terms of arts readiness, recovery, and response so that we have a better safety net for the arts and for artists and arts organizations. This slide just shows you our charter organizing members. And you'll note that Performing Arts Readiness was one of our steering committee members. I'll ask Tom to just say a word about that landmark program and how it came to be part of NCAPER.
Sure. Thanks, Molly. Between 2017 and the end of 2025, Performing Arts Readiness was sponsored by the Mellon Foundation, and we did a lot of work around the country on the idea of being able to help arts organizations, especially performing arts organizations, concentrate on disaster planning and response activities. And you will hear more at the end of the session about how all of our informational and workshop and other information is now on the NCAPER website. So all of our assets moved over to NCAPER.
Thank you, Tom. And this is one in a series of online classes for BAARN, the Bay Area Arts Readiness Network, a project funded by the Hewlett Foundation. This is the agenda for our workshop today, or our class today. We anticipate this running just about an hour. We'll be providing an introduction to business continuity, just the concept and the reasons for it. The actual process, what does business continuity process look like, and how to define and determine what your essential business functions are for artists and arts organizations that your business continuity plan wants to address. We'll talk through the steps of that planning, which include analyzing your business operations. We'll share an array of recovery and mitigation strategies to help protect your practice or your organization from threats. And then we'll talk about how business continuity plans should be not only developed, but then tested. Then we will have some time for Q&A. And as Tom mentioned, we'll also share information on some of the other resources that you can access outside of this class. I'll also just say that everything we share here is information for you to consider and weigh. These are not hard and fast rules. Take what is useful and what you can implement, you are the best judge of how this will relate to your operations, your practice, your organization. I'll also say up front that when we talk in this class about business, that means all of your professional activities. We'll use the terms artist and arts organizations and entity today throughout. And it really, we are trying to cover that entire spectrum of what kinds of operations you're involved in. So this does relate to you, whether you're a solo artist, a small collective, or an incorporated nonprofit organization. We hope that all of you will be able to take something valuable away from today. So this slide kind of presents two options of how you might operate in a crisis. On the left side, a disaster happens. At noon, what if you lose your your key leadership, and suddenly you have to appoint someone who has no experience or no preparation for the role. Going down at 3 o'clock, what if suddenly your space in which your offices or your programming or your studio space is located, suddenly that is inaccessible to you for any kind of reason? You might be in a mad scramble to try to find an alternate location. Down at 6 o'clock, if your data is lost or hacked or corrupted, do you have a process? If you don't, then you need to find ways, or you're just going to lose that data altogether. And in the worst case scenario at 9 o'clock, if you're not prepared and all of these emergencies kind of cascade, you may be forced to close down your organization. That is not what we want. We want to look at the right side of the slide, thinking about business continuity as something that you will undertake and can actually be built into your everyday operations. So there's a bit of a lift on the front end that we'll be talking about today, but hopefully this will get incorporated so that you will have at hand your impact analysis, your recovery strategies. You've developed your plan and you regularly update it by testing it, maintaining it, and making it a living part of your work. And the reasons for this are many. We know that it's important to implement a business continuity plan because it in the most serious situation, it might be able to save lives if a huge disaster hits. It could, constitute the survival or the long-term health of your organization or your practice. But it also, keeping your basic critical functions operating or continuing means that you're able to fulfill your mission. If you are a nonprofit, you have a mission, you have donors, stakeholders, community members, audiences. You want to be able to continue to fulfill that, even if a disaster hits. And it's just good business. You want to be able to maintain your relationships, your good reputation, as well as your cash flow with your funders and with your customers. So just to give you a couple of examples, this photo represents something that I have heard stories of them happening to artists. There may be a flood in a space that you rent. Suddenly there is mold. The landlord doesn't allow you access. You don't have access to any of your records, your equipment, your materials. There are some other examples. And again, we're not trying to scare you, but it's just sometimes it's easy to think about, I have a small practice or I have, a modest-sized organization. I think I could handle a crisis. Maybe you can. However, there are things that are going to come out that may come out of left field. We heard a story last spring of some major snows that happened in New England, and organizations that had never had to close during a snow event because they could handle a couple of feet suddenly had 10 feet of snow, and no one could get to their door, not even their staff could get in to see what the status of the building was. In an eastern state, we heard about 3 organizations that were unrelated. I mean, they didn't really have relationships to each other, but they were an historical society, a theater, and a museum, and they were all hit by ransomware attacks in the same period of time that affected their ticketing activities and their general business operations. The only common denominator, they were kind of in the same, physical proximity to each other. So there are myriad things, and as we work through all of our BAARN classes, I think we talk about the fact that you never know what hazard might hit you. What we want to encourage is you to figure out what your business, how you can continue your business and your activities regardless of what type of incident occurs, but you put into place practices and steps and policies that will allow you to maintain your critical business functions. We also want to just recognize that, we are people first. We want to approach any of these conversations about distressing events with care. So we recognize that our conversation today is describing and relating stories about people who are responding to the absolute worst days that you might need to experience. So we just, take in what you can, and we recognize that these are tough conversations that we're having. We're talking a lot about kind of mechanics and logistics today, But whatever your business continuity plan is on paper, people matter the most. And in a crisis situation, people are stressed. So we always want to assume the best, to be kind, and remember that we are part of a community, and community is what matters. We also encourage planning because not only does it kind of give you muscle memory so that you can act more quickly and effectively, but it also gives you time and that mental and emotional space so that if something occurs, you have that space instead of fretting about the things about your operations or the mechanical things. You can actually use that time and space to care for yourself. Self-care is important to care for other people. So just want to keep that that frame around people first. So we're going to talk in this introduction to business continuity about things that you might want to consider. Firstly, consider the scale of your operations. There is no one size fits all when it comes to business continuity plan. There is no template that we can give you that you just kind of fill in the blanks, because all of these things are going to be different. So that's why we're offering you principles and steps, so that you can create this for yourself, because it's going to depend on the scale of your operations, the discipline or disciplines in which you work, your location. Are you in an urban space or a rural space? Are you in a rented facility or a space that you own? I mean, all of those have an impact on your decisions. What the capacity is of both any facilities that you have, but also your own capacity. You're not going to get this all done tomorrow, and that's fine. But we hope that you'll do a little thing tomorrow and then a little thing next week to start to build this up. Also, alignment with values is really important. And I'm going to talk about that more in just a moment. And the last kind of principle that we like to work under is start where you are. You might already have a lot of the elements that we'll talk about today in place. That's great. You can just build on those. You don't need to recreate anything that you already have. But if you're brand new to this, please don't feel badly about not having done any of this before, even if some of these things seem obvious. You're here today, and that says a lot about your willingness to start protecting your practice and your organization and your mission. So just start where you are. These are working definitions that we offer in just about all of our classes, just so that we're having some of the same language. And we have here emergency, crisis, and disaster. And those all happen along a continuum, but they all are reasons where a good business continuity plan is going to help you get through. But generally, we define them like this, that an emergency might be a small kind of finite event with a beginning, middle, and an end, usually something that can be resolved internally, either to your practice or your organization, and is kind of smaller scale. We define a crisis as a point when a decision needs to be made. Changes, events are occurring, and at some point, you need to make a decision that is going to affect the outcome. So quick decisions and actions are necessary. That's why it's great to pre-think them and determine what you're going to do, so that you're not making these incredibly weighty decisions while you're in an emotional state in the middle of a crisis. A disaster, large scale, may impact many people, a wide geographic area, could be the result of multiple emergencies compounding on one another. But often it will affect some kind of infrastructure, communications perhaps, life safety, and might need some sort of public government response, whether that's at the county or state level, or for large events, FEMA, and having a federal response. A few more definitions as we move forward together. Business continuity is the capability of an entity to continue the delivery of products or services following a disruptive incident. And business continuity planning, what we're talking about today, is the process of creating systems of prevention and recovery to deal with potential threats. So the goal is to enable ongoing critical operations. And we kind of bracketed that because we're going to use business today a lot, even though you may work again in a solo practice or a nonprofit. But when you are interacting with others in this space, whether that's insurance or other kind of partners, emergency responders, they tend to think in terms of business as being encompassing. So just know that's why we are using this terminology. But again, the goal to enable ongoing critical operations is we want to encourage you to think about what are the most important things that you need to get up and running. And we'll talk about that in the business analysis that we'll do in a moment. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom to share some more definitions with you around all the types of hazards that this might protect you from.
Thanks, Molly. We want to take a look at the idea of a wide variety of types of emergencies, disasters, and crises. And depending on where you are in the country, you may have experienced some of these fairly recently. So we look at everything from the rain and windstorms that have been happening around the area, flooding as well. They might be smaller situations if it's just biological agents like pests or vermin, but they still can cause problems for your studio or your business. And then they might be larger scale, like pandemics and public health emergencies, which we learned a lot from. So these are a lot of the natural types of disasters that come to mind when we think of those terms right at the beginning. Now, on the next slide, unfortunately, this list keeps on growing. The sort of human-made types of disasters, vandalism, arson, and civil unrest, certainly. And some of the ones that we're unfortunately seeing growing are active shooter situations. We will be having a class this fall to address that type of disaster, as well as bomb threats, and then building failures, something maybe in the design or something in the maintenance of a building that might cause a disaster. In the next slide, the technological situation. And I always have to say, this is not my computer screen, even though sometimes when my IT is failing, I feel like I might want to do this to my computer. But from the power surges and equipment failure that we might have, but also from some of the systems we use, like software or internet systems that may cause technological concerns. And certainly that situation with the ransomware and cyber attacks that we heard about from the East Coast, and the city of Atlanta had a situation with a cyber attack and ransomware city office wide in the past couple of years. So a number of things to take a look at with the technological types of disasters. But here's a new category of crisis that we wanted to talk about. And I've been talking about this a lot over the past year and a half. Administrative disasters that we have seen sort of ramp up, whether it's funding changes or cuts from federal or state funders, and maybe some trends for our private funders as well. Socio-political shifts that may cause some concerns for our artistic practice. We'll definitely be talking a little bit about the idea of succession planning. So whether the departure of management staff or board members is sudden or is something you've planned for, it can certainly cause a ripple effect for your work. Reputational disasters. What can we do if, whether it's true or not, something happens to the reputation of your organization? And then certainly things like event and tour cancellations. Gosh, when I was talking about this a couple of weeks ago, I think every day up until the Friday I taught the class, I had been hearing about a tour cancellation. So these are things that are happening quite a bit, and we need to think about how can we plan for these? How can we deal with some of these types of situations? One other thing in our next slide that I wanted to mention is that artistic practices oftentimes have inherent risks, tight financial margins. The revenue sources may or may not be diversified for your practice. You might be a one-person practice or a small team, carrying many, many competing responsibilities from administration all the way to creating art or performing. Stewardship, the need to protect and continue unique artistic assets and processes, and this idea of being a long-term steward of your work or of a community's work. And there's always a tension between time and resources. What you have to spend on the administrative activities, what you think about with your reflection and planning for the future, and your creative practice. So all of those things need to be worked in and be considered as risks as you're moving forward in some of your planning. So I'll turn things back to Molly to have us take a look at sort of this idea of working with business continuity and why we would want to do that.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I'll kind of go through these statistics quickly, but they are a little jarring. Um, Last year in 2025, there were 119 federal disaster declarations. That means that the physical event was strong enough that the state couldn't handle it, and they had to ask for a presidential declaration and receive federal assistance. However, we know that there are thousands of daily, quote unquote, mundane emergencies and crises that we never hear about. They never make the news because it might affect one studio or one block or one building, but that can be just as devastating to you if it occurs. These statistics also that after disaster, 40% of small businesses don't immediately open, and a quarter of them close within a year, three-quarters of them within 3 years. So without a business continuity plan, you do not have your roadmap to keep going after disaster. Um, just a couple of other quick notes, disaster scale and priorities have an impact. Also, communities tend to rely on artists and arts experiences after a disaster, both for economic recovery, but also to bring communities together and just for that kind of spiritual and creative healing that needs to happen. And again, you want to make sure that you're able to carry out your mission if you have staff to maintain your revenue and employment and to protect those critical assets, unique assets that Tom mentioned. This is a graphic that I just want to share with you. It kind of falls into the definitions, but there are layers to your emergency planning, and BAARN is addressing all of them. But quickly, the very first thing in the center is your disaster and physical emergency plan. This is about human safety first, then property safety, making sure you have the ability to communicate with key people in an emergency. And then if there is physical damage or damage to your data, that you're able to quickly respond and salvage as much as possible. We already have recordings on the BAARN web page, Introduction to Emergency Preparedness, a risk assessment so that you can kind of figure out what are the risks and how can you mitigate them, and artist readiness and a guided tour of an emergency and resources you can call on. So know that information is available to you. What we're talking about today is the next layer out, the continuity of operations. You'll hear business continuity, continuity of operations, COOP plan. That's all this sphere where it's about restarting the operations that are critical to your practice or your mission. This typically includes things like communications, both internally and with the public, IT, restarting activities, or reopening your facility if it's been compromised. The next layer out is a readiness plan. And this is where we really want to encourage you to think about what you would do if any of your operations or resources are interrupted or disrupted in some way. This, not just IT and buildings, but programming, your assets and collections, your people. So how do you keep your operations going? And we do also have a recorded session on Artist Readiness 101, on the BAARN site, and that introduces you to the idea of a readiness plan. And then the last sphere out, the resiliency plan, is really much larger. It tends to look externally rather than internally, and it's how to adapt to a changing environment in the long term. And this typically looks at the larger community and cross-sector. And so we'll be looking at resiliency planning when we roll out our network trainings that'll be happening this fall. We just wanted you to kind of see where we sit. So we're in the kind of second layer out today. A few more definitions, and again, these are used in the business sphere and insurance sphere, so we want you to be aware of them. Business continuity planning, as we've mentioned, is a way to identify vulnerabilities and mitigate losses to your organization, plan for your continued activity. IT recovery planning, just what it says, recovering your hardware and software and data. Emergency response planning, again, that middle section, immediate protection of life, safety, assets, and potentially the environment in an emergency situation. And then, as Tom mentioned, emergency succession planning, this process to make sure that there are people in the pipeline who are available and prepared to step in if a key person is suddenly unavailable to you. So these are all elements that are going to be part of your business continuity plan. So again, because there is no one size fits all, here are some ways that we want to encourage you to start thinking as we move into the next section of this class, is how to approach your own planning process. First of all, define your values. What do you care most about? Your plan should be related to what your most important things are. So for instance, if you are an organization and community engagement is the most important thing for you, then once you're disrupted, your most important critical operation might be getting your facility back up and open and making sure that people know that, right? So facilities and communication. If you are an organization and your mission is about preserving the canon, you might be, it's not necessarily important for you to get your facility back open, but maybe it's about restoring and protecting your assets, your music library, your recordings. If you're an individual artist and you rely on the work that you make and sell for your revenue, your most critical business operation might be in getting your sales back up and running. So again, use all of this information through the lens of your own values and what's most important to you. So you'll want to determine your objectives. All of this, when you boil it right down, is about which operations and systems need to return to full operation immediately. And that may be not, certainly this is important for, hospitals and infrastructure, but you might decide if a disaster happens, you don't need to do anything right away except make sure that you and your family are safe. But what can wait 24 or 48 hours or longer? What needs to happen more quickly? And what needs protecting? So again, just some things to tailor this for you. Any plan is the result of intentional decision making. So we hope that you will write down your business continuity plan and update it over time. But what's important is the thought process that you go through to make decisions about, again, these things, what are most important, and what's the sequence and the timing. And that's a way to sketch out your plan structure. So we are going to get into much more detail, but this kind of boils it down to the basics. The standard contents of a business continuity plan that is written down include these. You'll want to have the date and the person created so that you know how old it is and if newer versions come up. Write down the physical locations that the plan covers, particularly if you have multiple buildings or office and programming spaces. It's great to have an introduction, just the purpose and how to use it, so that if new people come into the team, it's clear to them what this business continuity plan is for and when to implement it. Your organizational structure, your business continuity team in particular. If you took or will look at our class on emergency preparedness, we talk about an emergency response team. kind of taking charge of things in a crisis to make decisions and activate your emergency plan. That might well be, particularly if you're small or a solo artist, you might be the business continuity and emergency response team all together. So that those might be the same set of people. You want to think and document the scope of the plan. You know, how much of your operations does this cover? And then literally write down your disaster response steps and process, what your recovery steps are. So once the life and the human safety piece has passed, then what are your steps to recovering your operations? You'll want to document what your preparation is and what your means and schedule of training and testing is. It's also great to have a contact list of important partners, vendors, contacts, stakeholders, and then a time frame. How are you going to carry this out? You can't do all of this tomorrow. So what's going to be your time frame about what happens when? What's the chronology of that? So we are going to talk through 4 steps of a business continuity planning process. The first is the business impact analysis. The second is thinking through your recovery strategies. Third is then taking all of that kind of assessment and decision making to put it into your plan, develop your plan. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's always important, are the testing and the exercises. So we'll take these one by one. Business impact analysis. The first step to take is to gather your key people. Again, this might be you. If you are a solo artist, you might want to gather with a couple of colleagues, maybe that work close to you or work in the same discipline, and you can kind of brainstorm and help each other out as you develop these. If you share a studio, for instance, gaining consensus about your critical operations, identifying your top risks, and then breaking them down into steps and processes. So gathering your key people, the whole part of this process starts with determining who's going to be involved, and they need to be people who understand how your critical functions operate. And in an organization, this might be a committee, it might be staff or board or both. It may or may not be, again, the same as your emergency response team, but you want people to participate to bring good information to the process. Again, in an individual practice, you might want to consider working with other artists. The next step is to identify your functions, and we have started this for you. We've identified 8 areas of activity that just about all arts organizations and artists fall into. You might not do all 8 of these, but these should cover you pretty well. And those are your programming, which for an artist, that might be your creative process and your sales or distribution. People, whether that's volunteers, staff, board, facilities, administrative facilities, storage facilities, programming facilities, production facilities. Your IT and data, hardware and software, communications, both internal and external, finances, legal and insurance, assets, collections, and inventory. And we have found that sometimes if you're a performing artist or performing arts organization, you might not think about assets and collections the way that a visual artist or a collecting institution might, but we encourage you to think about all of your assets, whether those are instruments, recordings, equipment, costumes and props. Those are all assets that should be considered in your planning. And lastly is community. None of us work in a vacuum. And so thinking about how you interact with your community in a crisis, and again, to get your business operations going again is important. So you may want to just kind of think about these 8 buckets as you think about what are your most important and critical activities. So once you kind of laid out, okay, these are what falls into my 8 buckets, you need to decide which are critical. And you might want to divide them into these categories. So mission critical, these are things that must always remain operational. In the arts, you may have few or none of those in that category. The second one is immediate services. These are things that you have to restore in less than 12 hours. And then moving back to normal operations that don't need to be restored. Again, feel free to adapt this as you want. You might decide things that need to happen in the first 24 to 48 hours, things that happen in the first week, and then things that happen after that. So once you have identified kind of your overall scope of your operations and then decided which are the most critical, the next thing that you want to do is think about risk. What are the most likely hazards that your activities or your operations might experience? For instance, here are some scenarios that we have heard happen. A 3-day outdoor festival. On day 2, we're now getting these kind of, microbursts or storms that aren't forecast. Unexpected heavy wind and rain, obviously affect staged events, people in booths and tents. A hacker getting into your system could hijack your patron and donor database, potentially getting sensitive information that you need to deal with. You may experience a powerful earthquake that strikes in the middle of the day and damages your facility, and some employees are unaccounted for. What is going to be your method for making sure that you find them and deal with the structural damage in a safe way? Your artist co-op studio or gallery is on the same street as a courthouse, and there's a controversial trial happening. It may have nothing to do with you, but it could affect you in your space, people coming in and out of your space, the safety of your space. So those are all plausible scenarios. What we encourage you to do as an exercise is to identify your potential hazards, consider their impact, how seriously would this affect your operations, and then think about their likelihood. And this is a way to give you a little bit of an objective kind of mathematical method of deciding what am I going to pay the most attention to. So as an example, say you are a ballet company and you rely greatly on your Nutcracker performances for a high volume of your earned revenue every year. If something were to happen to disrupt or mean that you can't hold those performances, that could be, a high impact. The likelihood, how likely is that to happen? Multiply those so you get a number. One example we use is the impact if you were to be hit, by a nuclear strike. The impact would be 3, but the likelihood of that is going to be a 1. However, if you have the Nutcracker scenario, the impact of having to cancel those performances would be moderate. The likelihood might be moderate if you are maybe in a rented facility, you don't have control, you don't know what might happen. That would be a 4. So that is a risk that you might want to pay more attention to. Again, use your judgment, but think about the things that would be a minor impact, a moderate impact, or the things that would be so severe that it would threaten, your livelihood or the continuation of your organization. So that concludes the business impact analysis piece. Step 2 is thinking about, okay, I've thought about my operations, I've thought about the risks and hazards. Now, what are going to be my recovery strategies? You want to research documents and what resources you would be required to have. Identify the gaps between those needs and your current capacities and capabilities, so you can figure out what gaps do I need to fill. Exploring what strategies you might put into play to recover, and then to select those and implement those. So that's the sequence of decisions that you'll want to make. So identifying and documenting the resources required. Looking at the analysis you've just done and thinking about, these are my most critical operations. What would you need to have in place to continue or restart? You want to create a document with actions and responsibilities and keep that accessible. For example, if one of your critical functions requires some sort of supplies to make that happen, you might want to identify alternate suppliers ahead of time so that you get them no matter what. If you maintain your building, and you would be responsible for any restoration or repair to keep your programs going, that might be part of your business continuity plan. And you want to make sure that you have vendors on call that would assist with that in a timely manner. If you are reliant on people to carry out your critical functions, you might need backups for those people. It might be artistic, might be administrative, but are they available? Do they have the training or the information to step in if they're needed to? And if you rely on some automated tasks that are critical in your analysis, you might want to think about how could I do this manually if I had to, at least for a short period of time. So just some examples of how to begin to identify what resources you're going to need to carry out your business continuity plan. Then you are likely that some of these things you don't already have. So this is your gap analysis. What did you just decide that you need, and what do you have in hand, and what's that gap? You might, for instance, decide that your insurance is not sufficient. That's a gap that you want to fill. Again, as I just mentioned with people, cross-training so that if key people are absent, others are able to carry out their key functions. Reserves funds, if you know that you might need to conduct repairs or buy supplies and equipment to continue your most important functions, you might want to put funds in reserve and save them for that rainy day. If having power and access to electrical equipment or data or computers is one of your critical functions, you want to have uninterrupted power sources and generators. Again, I think you get the point. We also recommend, we just always promote this, that your data, which these days all of us need access to our data to really do any of our jobs. You want to make sure that you have cloud-based backups and follow the 3-2-1 rule, which is having 3 copies of any kind of important data or information in 2 different places, in 2 different mediums. And I'm sorry, Tom, the 3-2-1 rule.
Yes, with the idea of 3 copies in at least 2 separate places, and then you want to have them, one of them in the cloud, for sure, for your backup. So there are a number of ways to do this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit in the IT recovery section too.
Great. Thanks for saving me there. The third step in this column of the planning process is to think about what your strategies would be. So you've thought about your critical functions, what resources you're going to need, but then what are the actual actions that you might be able to take to recover? And these are some of those examples. Hazard mitigation, which is reducing risk, prevention and protection, finding alternate locations, locating and having on-call vendors and services, and then making sure that you will be able to restore communications. So let's dig into those just a little bit further. Hazard mitigation, again, are actions taken to help reduce or eliminate risks. So this is eliminating or limiting the damage that something could do to you. Environmental shifts, you also, again, these are living strategies. So we know that shifts in weather patterns and climate are affecting us, and differently in different areas of the country. You might have new development or new neighbors around your physical area, and that might also change your risks. If you have a new manufacturing facility open close to you, there might be industrial accident risks that you are open to that might have not existed before. So anything that changes in your environment is a reason to just, again, look at that and say, does this provide a potential hazard to me that I want to mitigate? So addressing obvious risks and considering potential risks. And again, when you're looking at what your risk exposure is, you want to consider how the time impact relates specifically to your critical functions. So if you were to be struck by a hazard or struck by a disaster, how does time impact your ability to return to your critical functions? Prevention and protection is a cousin to mitigation. And these are things like making sure that you are protecting your property and your artistic assets, that you are connected to emergency services, and that you are addressing structural projects. So let's look at some of the ways some of these recovery strategies can play out. This is a laundry list. Please don't be scared, but this is a list of all of the different kinds of insurance that may be relevant to your practice or to your organization as a nonprofit. None of you will need all of these, but it's just important to think about the array of things. Some of these are obvious general liability insurance. If you're a nonprofit, hopefully you have directors and officers insurance. But if you travel, if you have staff who travel in company vehicles, you might want commercial vehicle insurance. There are special types of insurance for special types of risk. For instance, special events and concerts and event interruption. They are expensive, but you can find policies, for instance, if your certain incidents were to cancel your Nutcracker performances, that you could recoup some money through your insurance policy. You also, the bottom element on this list is to refer to Serve Plus, the Craft Emergency Relief Fund. They have some wonderful insurance resources for studio artists. And one of the things that they always encourage us to remind folks is that if you have a home studio, your homeowner's insurance is unlikely to cover any equipment or materials that you have in place that are part of your business activities. You're going to want separate business insurance for your artistic practice. So making that plug. This is an example of, again, that event that happened in New England last spring. This is a music venue that had never had this scale of snow before. And this was, just feet and feet of snow, affected their ability to carry out their activities. But there was also a restaurant across the street that would provide the food and drink for the venue because they had the food license. So, again, just an example of the unexpected that can occur. Next to emergency response planning. And Tom, I think I may have skipped over some of the material that you wanted to share, but I will keep moving. Great. Emergency response planning, again, an immediate incident happens. It could be an injury, it could be a fire. You want to be prepared. And this graphic shows how an emergency response process works. We have a class on this, so I won't go into detail, but this does kind of graphically show how an incident occurs. There should be an emergency response team in place who does the initial assessment. Is there imminent danger? Do we need to activate our emergency plan? If no, fine, we move back to regular operations. But if yes, how do we move into our emergency plan so that everyone knows what they're doing, what their responsibilities are, and how to be safe? So this is just, again, a little plug for having an emergency response team. If you are an individual artist, this might be you, which is why it's good to get a colleague who may be physically in close proximity to your location, and you can be on each other's emergency response teams. When you're looking at emergency response planning, the priorities are to make sure that humans are safe, handle it if you can, call 911 if you can't, can activate your emergency response team. Um, Generally, in most events, an emergency operations center would not be necessary unless it's a hugely large scale event and you are a pretty large scale organization. But always then assess the impact and keeping people informed. I think as we do workshops, yeah, I think the biggest frustration that we hear about is that people don't really know what's going on. They can't get good information. They don't know, if the building was impacted, am I supposed to come to work or am I supposed to work from home? All of those things. So making sure that you have a way to communicate with people and let them know true information and accurate information about what's going on is really important. Now I am going to turn it over to Tom to talk about emergency succession planning.
Sure. One of the things that we have really become aware of, particularly since the time of the pandemic, is the need for succession planning to be something that you do as part of your continual activities at an organization, not just something that happens when you find out that somebody is leaving or someone has to be out for a number of months. So it's difficult to think about possible illness, injury, death, or resignation or dismissal of key people. But if we can deal with this and think about and document some of the directions we might go, we don't have to deal with the stress of an emergency without preparation, where an unplanned departure can and has thrown organizations into a lot of turmoil with adverse consequences, including the organization having to cancel some performances, all of those types of things. So having this type of succession plan definitely alleviates stress and allows your operations to continue. And there are a number of things that we can point you toward. And so I would say there are some steps that we see that have been really helpful to create an effective plan. Establish an emergency leadership transition team. Think about getting that down on paper. Who would be the people who, if your executive director, artistic director, or others left, who would help get this team put together to make the transitions? What is the board's responsibility? In some cases, I have seen the responsibility be written into the plans for board members to step in and work in the ED role. Identify who that interim ED would be, and always review and update job descriptions. Trying to do this on a yearly basis is really important, just so everyone in the organization is clear about what their role is. And if we have to hire somebody in our standard hiring or in succession planning, things are clear. Assign backup individuals for critical functions and cross-train staff. That is the thing I hear the most from organizations that have had to go through this, and that cross-training is important. And what is the transition's impact on the organization's culture? It might be, if you've had the same executive director for 40 years, that if that person leaves, part of the character of the organization may change. And again, we say this in almost everything we've been highlighting, but developing a communications plan is extremely important. On the next slide, um, the another thing that's really important, and you can see this is sort of harkening back to some of the gap analysis things that Molly talked about a couple of slides ago. Where are some of the gaps? What about alternative locations? If flooding hits your location, as it did in Houston during Hurricane Harvey and some of the storms after that, what can you do for alternate locations? What types of spaces could you utilize for either your individual artwork or for types of performances? Having it pre-identified with agreements in place is important. Different spaces, your space might not have all of these needs and priorities, but what do you need in the front of the house and backstage? Do you need rehearsal and classroom spaces built in? Some organizations even lease out or rent out their rehearsal and classroom spaces, and that is another revenue developer. Administrative space, is that in the same building that your performances take place in? Studio or shop space for the areas where you're creating props. And then storage, which always can be kind of exciting because oftentimes that might be a little bit away from your main location, and keeping an eye on that so you don't have a disaster there while everything seems great at your performance space is important as well. So think about that, alternative locations. Think about the idea of IT recovery planning. We've talked about, I started out early in the class talking about the IT disasters that can happen. And Molly has been talking about how dependent we are on this. So having a backup schedule and data recovery processes with your priorities listed is important. Having a diagram of your network components. And this can be for an individual artist as simple as, where your monitor is, where any kind of CPU is, your internet and other types of connections, and then the idea of do you have a printer? How does that work? So diagramming those network components, no matter how big or small they are. Where is your data? Is it on servers? What servers and where are they? Is it cloud-based storage? Who can access it? Can you access it? Can you access it without a charge? That's important to look at as well. Who has computers and devices? How many of them are there and who has them? And what operating system and platform are they on? And have they been kept up to date? And then internal and mobile phones for emergency messaging. We're seeing more and more of that being used. I've actually seen a number of festival promoters who are doing emergency text chains for their lead staff during an event. And where can you immediately restart your computer activities at a hot site or set up to restart, which is a warm site? You'll hear people talking about those as well. So these are basics, but some things as core considerations. And then I want to talk about recovery vendors. And, you might say, oh, I'm going to bring in that person who can clean up my place where I got water in my facility. Well, you need to think about all of these different physical plant services and what the systems are. You need to think about the systems for IT, marketing, and ticketing. Those all might be different. What are your personnel systems for operations, artistic, financial, and communications? All of those are important. And then we get to the cleanup vendors, water and fire cleanup, hazmat, salvage of your artwork. Can you work with a conservator to do that? Programmatic materials and business records as well. And consider developing relationships that don't already exist. If you look at this list and say, oh boy, I don't have anybody who can help back up on any of these, talk with us because we know a lot of people who do this kind of work. And unfortunately, we know a lot of organizations that have had to go through this kind of work. And finally, in the next slide here, in my area on these recovery strategies, the idea of crisis communication. Again, it is the sort of wheel of fortune here, and everything ends up on communication. We need to have effective communication with our staff, with our board, with our audience, with our community. Accurate, providing transparency and being timely and consistent, ongoing to reach the appropriate stakeholders and key community members, and proactive. And Molly put this down. You can't undo bad communications, that is for sure. And we have a wonderful performing arts readiness class on crisis communications that is available and is one of our most popular classes. So that is another thing to look at. And I'll go back to Molly. We're getting very close to our wrap up here, but I'll go back to Molly for a couple of other things.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, we are on the home stretch. So once you have done all the analysis, thought through these recovery strategies and what resources you want to start to collect, now you're in the place to actually develop your plan and put it onto paper. So that includes the framework, putting your recovery team together, writing down your procedures, documenting any manual workarounds, and train, practicing the plan. So again, this is just a reminder that this is a suggested format of how you might actually structure the written and or digital version of your plan. It is a living document, so you want to, again, make sure that it doesn't get stale, it doesn't get dusty. When people change, when vendors change, if new procedures come into place, if you add new programs, or if you add new materials, or you purchase new equipment, anything significant like that, you want to make sure you look back at your business continuity plan and what impact that might have. And also, when an event occurs, best practice is to do some reflection, do an after action review, analyze what worked, what didn't, and maybe should change, and then you change the plan accordingly. We also want to think about distribution. People who are going to be responsible for carrying out any of the business continuity plan need to be aware and instructed on their role and always have access to copies of the plan. And lastly is testing and exercising. There are all kinds of ways to undertake exercises and maintenance to keep your plan alive and up to date. And you want to, again, validate that these recovery strategies are going to work. Verify that the systems and equipment are going to perform the way that they're designed to. And these don't have to be big, huge undertakings, but they can be things like a checklist test. Do we have, if your business continuity plan says you're going to have these emergency resources in place, go talk to the people who should have them and go through your checklist. Are they on site, or is the money put away, or is this list developed? A structured walkthrough test. Walking through your facility and looking at the elements that you have identified as critical and have the risks been mitigated and contained as much as possible. Emergency evacuation drills. I am shocked at how few individual artists and arts organizations are not doing the drills that we did all the time when we were in school. So it makes people safe. And I was just at a conference talking about how people announce drills ahead of time, and then people just sit and keep working at their computer because they're busy. And what that does is it puts other people into danger, because if it is suddenly a real emergency and you're not able to get out safely, that means that people behind you, or others in the building, might be at risk because they need to come back and get you. So it is a responsibility not just for your own safety, but for everyone around you. And then literally doing a simulation, doing a tabletop, pretending an event happens, bring in everybody on the business continuity team. And if this happened, what do you do? What do you do? Do we have this in place? Literally kind of doing an exercise. And keeping it maintained. Once you've developed, again, you want to keep it alive. Make sure that contact information is always up to date, at least annually, preferably more frequently than that. Also, people move around. They may not leave the organization, but they might move to a different department, or they might get promoted into a different role. So you want to make sure that as those changes happen, the plan is adapted, or people are trained in the plan to make sure that everything is cohesive. And again, if people are not coming to their work location, how do they know that? Are they equipped to work from their alternate location? And again, sometimes that changes. We all were working from home, and then in the last year or so, some of those policies are changing. You want to make sure that that's updated and written down and communicated with everyone.
So
That is the summary of business communication. And if you do have any questions, we would be happy to take those. Just use the Q&A function. I'm not seeing that any exist right now.
Okay.
So while people think about any questions they might have, I'm going to toss it back to Tom to talk about some of the existing resources.
Yes, great. And yeah, I wanted to talk with you about those materials from Performing Arts Readiness that are at the ncaper.org site. Um, First thing is that we had a number of case studies, including Dancing in the Light, Dance Institute of Washington's transformation after the loss of its founder, which actually started a lot of focus from our services on succession planning. And then Balboa Park Online Collaborative talked about what happened with a power outage. So these are the kind of things where people are taking situations that happened at their organizations, and it shows some of the reasons we need to have these business resumption capabilities. On the next slide, these are 20 of the about 27 webinars from PAR that are available on ncaper.org. And you'll see that there's a business continuity class there as well. We have really taken that class and expanded it to show more about what individual artists can do, but you'll also see crisis communication, cybersecurity, and a wide variety of classes here. These classes are recordings by faculty who taught for us for a number of years, and these are available for free as you would like to use them. And the other thing to think about is that we mentioned Hurricane Harvey, and the Houston Arts Alliance actually responded to Hurricane Harvey by putting together short videos on a wide variety of topics, including many of them that we talked about today, like cybersecurity, continuing to work, and preservation and conservation of materials. These are short, they're bite-sized, they're 3 or 4 minutes, but they're really helpful, and you can get to them through HAA's YouTube channel. And for our last slide, I will just say thank you to Ellen Korpar, who created this class for PAR, and many of Ellen's ideas are brought forward and expanded upon here. And this has information for contacting me or contacting Molly with questions as you're developing your plans, or questions if you have a type of emergency and need some assistance with the response. So I'll throw it back over to Molly to close things up. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with all of you today.
Great. Thank you for joining us. We wish you well in your business continuity planning process. And I'll just put in a plug. We will hold our next BAARN class on September 15th, and that will be a disaster response for artists and arts organizations. So again, as you're looking at those different layers, we want to offer you assistance in working in all of those spheres. So thanks very much for joining us. Stay safe. Bye-bye.